Chapter 12, Part 3, Our Trip to Italy. So I hope you remember the big ideas from the north, that there were a lot of advances, a lot of attention to detail, a lot of delight in visual details. So in Italy now, we're just going to be focusing on this one country, and you can see by the looks of this map that it's kind of like a patchwork quilt. And so Italy does not become a single unified country until very late in the 19th century. Um, and we have papal states here with Rome. But up here is the Republic of Florence. It includes Florence and Pisa and Fiesole. But Siena is also close by. We've seen some pieces from Siena. That's here. The Papal States, though, go from coast to coast and reach up here into the north. So it's a little bit confusing. It's not going to be much of a factor, except when you realize that they're not all on the same page and they're not all on good terms. So um, anyway, let's look at again the big ideas of the Renaissance that we saw last time: increased naturalism, use of linear perspective, innovations in media, including oil painting, paper printing, both relief and intaglio. Humanism, the affirmation of the value of our existence, and the vocabulary of their diptych, triptych, polyptych, perspective, illusionism, and contrapposto. What is new in Italy is the revival of classical style. So, Italy, of course, was the hotbed of Rome, and so it's the location of Rome. So, we're going to get more interest in classicism down there. Cultural centers at the end of the Middle Ages included Florence, Milan, Venice, Mantua, Ferrara, and Urbino. Beginning around 1400, painters and sculptors began to render the illusion of physical reality with weighty three-dimensional forms. Architects used mathematically derived design principles and orders. So, this description of what the painters did should remind you of Giotto with his weighty three-dimensional forms in his paintings. So, when we looked at Giotto, I said, this leads right into the Renaissance. So, I hope you remember. Early Italian Renaissance architecture in Florence. So, Filippo Brunelleschi was a principal pioneer of Florentine architecture. Shown here is the Cathedral of Florence, or the Duomo. It's called the Duomo. And it was a medieval structure. It stood like this. Giotto's tower's right there. The baptistry's over here. Everything is separate, remember, in an Italian cathedral. So separate building, and then the cathedral's all one building. So it sat as just a basilica for a very long time, and it wanted a dome. It was inspired by the dome in Rome, which is of course the Pantheon, but it wanted to outdo it. So it had a competition of designers who could design a big dome, because it was a big building. And I'm so glad I found this picture recently to include in this, so you can get a sense of the scale of it, because it is sort of largish looking. It looks hefty, so you don't really get a sense of the scale of the human here. But here's a group of humans standing around the edge up there of the dome. So you can see it's pretty enormous. So Filippo Brunelleschi was the man who solved the problem of the design. There are lots of movies, and it's a popular subject. So if you want to go deep on that and see his solution, you can. The dome of Florence Cathedral was a feat of engineering with an octagonal outer shell and a lower inner shell. So there's two different shells. Each portion reinforced the next one as it was built layer by layer with no external support. And it's also sort of constructed on the principle of Gothic rib vaulting. So if you think of it like that, might help. Anyway, it's still standing today, obviously. And Florence Cathedral which we just saw with their brand new dome. They were getting so excited. Sponsored a competition for an artist to create a new set of bronze doors for the baptistry right across the street. They chose the scene of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. This is a Hebrew scripture story. Surviving panels belong to the assumed finalists Lorenzo Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, the same guy who just designed the dome. So Brunelleschi was familiar with the legend of Giotto, who had lived much earlier, and he thought he was one of those geniuses as well. So he thought since he could design the dome, he could do anything. He could write poetry and do sculpture and do painting. He could do it all. So on the left is Filippo Brunelleschi's entry in the competition. So each artist who wanted to do the new doors for the baptistry had to create this one panel as his entry piece, and then it was judged, probably blindly, I don't know. So the one on the left is Brunelleschi's, the one on the right is Ghiberti's. So Ghiberti's just a sculptor. He doesn't pretend to be a genius or uniquely gifted by God at all, although, that may change. So the story is, and every time we look at some new iconography, you're going to get a little bit more of the biblical stories, because I think to appreciate the art, you really have to understand the narration of the story that they're illustrating. So the story was Abraham was a very old man, and he had one son, and the son was his pride and joy, and he had been born really late in his life. And he was a man of God. He was the only person who was really following. He had been called by the God of Israel, the one God, to honor him, to worship him. So he was chosen. Then God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son to show how much he loved him. And Abraham, loved his son, but he also loved God, and he wanted to obey God. So he took his son up to a mountain to sacrifice him, went up with the goal of doing that. And in this iconography, Abraham goes up with some men, shown down here, here, and over here. So he has some helpers and a donkey who help carry up the firewood, because he's going to kill his son and then offer it as a burnt sacrifice to God. So that's what's shown here. So Abraham gets ready to kill Isaac, and just as he's about to kill him, the angel comes down from heaven and stops him. So in this one, here's Abraham, here's his son who's nude, kneeling on an altar, and the angel reaches out his arm and grabs Abraham's arm, which is holding a knife. His left hand is gripping Isaac around the neck, and his right hand holds a knife. He's going to cut his throat. And the angel stops him and says, "Don't do that. We were just testing you." And here's a ram, a goat, which has been caught in a thicket. It's in the Bible. So you can sacrifice him instead. So Abraham does. He takes his son Isaac home, and everybody lives happily ever after. So this is Brunelleschi's solution. He puts Isaac right in the center, puts the altar of offering right in the middle, gives a sort of a diagonal to Abraham leaning in, and then it's almost like there's two registers, and the lower register here has the helpers, a man and a man there, and the donkey. God, I keep getting lines, and so it's pretty symmetrical. It's just pretty standard. I mean, it's nice. And there's the little ram, but Ghiberti solved it slightly differently. So the same story, the same narration. Here's Abraham. This time he's holding his knife with his downstage hand, his right hand. So you can see that whole arm extended, the knife pointing directly at Isaac's face. Isaac is looking up at him. His nice anatomy showing here, fully frontal. Here's the altar over on the right side. There's a very strong diagonal created by this outcropping of rocks. And then the lower left section is where the two helpers and the donkey are. The ram caught in the thickets way up here at the top of these rocks. And then here's the exciting part. The angel is like popping out of the background in what is called foreshortening, where you don't see the entire length of the angel because we're looking at him head on. So we just see his head, his chest, and his arms sort of popping out of the background. So Ghiberti's panel was a little more forward thinking. He won the competition. Then, so he got the commission to design the new doors, which coincidentally did not use that particular panel. So he had to do 20 panels, and you can see them all. Oh no, sorry, he had 20 years to do the panels. There are more than 20 panels here. He had to do them at the rate of 3 a year. And so it was steady income for 20 years. And it was a great gig because artists were really wanting this job. It also put it right on the front of the baptistry where everybody in Florence would see it and everybody would admire him and call him a genius. So he did this and he completed that in his 20 years. It's great. And Brunelleschi sort of gave up sculpture. I think he had been embarrassed, maybe humiliated, because he didn't win. He was just so full of himself. So he does nothing but architecture from that point on. And he does amazing architecture. He creates many, many structures in Florence. And we're only going to look at this one after the dome, of course. And I love this building. I love this interior. So this is the nave of the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. And it's the choir and transept. So you can see we're looking down here towards the altar, the main altar of the church. And we're in a basilica. I think you should be able to read that. A very nice nave arcade here. There's no gallery. There's clear story windows. There's a nice flat coffered roof up here, a flat timber roof. It's also very dark. Now here's the thing I want you to get, that this structure comes after Gothic cathedrals, comes after all of those amazing, intricate, high, soaring structures that we saw. This is built after that. If anything, it looks like an old Roman basilica. It looks like the earliest churches we saw. It also looks Romanesque. The windows are very small. The arches are round. So what Brunelleschi did is took the old ideas of the Romanesque basilica and he perfected it. He perfected it by having these beautiful ratios of circles to squares, of carefully planning the size of each and every element of the curve of the arches. And look at how this gaze down into the apse, you get these echoing arches, just one right over the other. So he's taken the idea and perfected it. And then also, you can't help but notice that the colors here are very simple. It's just 2 tones of gray. It's not full of a lot of sculpture. It's not colorful. It's not breathtaking. It's not overwhelming at all. It's very kind of calm and beautiful in its perfection. So perfection is one of the big ideas of the Italian Renaissance, and we're going to see this in sculpture and painting too, is just sort of establishing a balance of all elements and making it as perfect as you possibly can. So this is the interior of San Lorenzo. And this is just by contrast. So this was done, San Lorenzo dates from the 15th century, and there's Chartres, 1200. So to say that this is the older one is kind of shocking, actually. But I hope you get it. And there's a 10th century basilica there. So this was our nice Ottonian basilica that we saw that has much more in common with the Church of San Lorenzo. And Santa Sabina, our Roman one. Yeah, we can't forget her. Now here's another shocker for that gorgeous interior. This is the exterior of San Lorenzo. Um, Often the buildings are designed, he was designing that with the interior in mind. And I don't know if he never had a design for the facade or if he did, but it was never financed or what happened, but it was never built. So the facade of San Lorenzo to this day is just sort of rough stone. It was made to be ready for something a little bit showier, but it never got built. So that's all there is. So if you ever find yourself in Florence and you're walking around and you happen to see this crude looking structure, just go in and explore, because even when you get back into these spaces, it's just stunningly beautiful. Here's something that's not a church, and this is a palace. So this is secular architecture. This is attributed to Michelozzo. You don't need to know the name. This is the Medici Palace, where the very powerful Medici family lived in Florence. So they commissioned him to build this. And it was not just their home, but it was also their workplace. This was very common in a lot of cities in Europe, is that people would live above their work. So you can see 3 floors here. The bottom floor of this, like I said, is their workplace. So it's on street level. They were money lenders. So it's really kind of like a bank. There were no banks like we think of them as these government watched over institutions, but it was all sort of private people with large amounts of money who would lend money out at interest to other people. And that was the function of the bank. So the exterior is very unostentatious. They did not want to appear showy. They were new money in Florence, and there was a lot of resentment in Florence for their wealth and their power. So they didn't want to rub it in Florentine people's noses. So they kind of kept a low profile here. It is a big building. So notice on the facade now that the 3 different floors have 3 different surfaces on them. And this was intentional. This was part of the design. The very rough and large stonework on the bottom is called rustication. It was an intentional desire to make it look rough and sort of like an old medieval castle, and to look strong like a medieval castle, so that if you put your money in this bank, it's not going to anywhere. It's going to stay there because nobody can rob this bank. So it looks kind of like Fort Knox. The next layer up is much smoother. And then the top layer is completely smooth. This is where the Medici lived. This was their living rooms. I'll show you some of the artwork that they collected there. They also became huge patrons of the arts, and a lot of artists got their start working for the Medici family. So another thing before we leave this is the Renaissance style is very horizontal. So we have these unbroken floors of just this pattern that doesn't alter, just window, 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 and then you get to the end. And the same thing here. And even the bottom, there's just 2 doors and then these grills and grilled windows. But there's no big fancy entryway at all here. This is the interior. So you go through one of those doorways and there would be a courtyard on the inside. And this is a leftover from old Rome. This is how Italians and a lot of people around the Mediterranean live and build to this day. They will have all their yards and gardens and their outdoor spaces on the inside, completely surrounded by the structure of the building. So this is the courtyard of the Medici Palace. It's where they would hang out their laundry and do their messy work. And now it's I believe people park cars in their courtyards. So let's see some more artwork that was being created in early Renaissance Italy, especially Florence. So early Italian Renaissance art sculpture in Florence, Donatello made the statue of David to draw on the classical tradition of heroic nudity. It is unknown when the statue was made, but it was first recorded in 1469. Some historians cite the angular pose as an attempt to heighten the character's heroism, while others see overt homoeroticism. So this is the first time that a nude has been used in this context since the classical world. During the medieval period, we saw nude figures representing souls. So in judgment scenes, there would be little nude figures representing human souls. And Adam and Eve, of course, were always shown nude. But this is not any of those figures. This is David, who's a hero from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures. And Donatello is reviving this form from the classical word, the contrapposto. So here he is. All of David's weight is on his right leg. His left leg is free and is up on top of Goliath's head. So this also brings me to the story of the narration of David. So David has a lot written in the Hebrew Scriptures about him. So I'm just going to skip to the part of this scene. So David was a very young boy, and the Israeli army or the Hebrew army was fighting the Philistine army, and the Philistines had a giant on their side named Goliath. And every day Goliath would come out in front of the army and kind of thump his chest and say, "Send out your best warrior and I'll take him on." And I think people were trying that, but everybody was being defeated. So David comes along. He's just a kid. He says, I can take that giant. I'll do this. The king, who was with the Hebrew army, said, "Well, here, take my armor and wear it." And David said, "No, I don't need that armor. It'll just get in my way." The Bible doesn't say that he actually went out with nothing on. It just says he doesn't wear armor. But Donatello interprets that as a complete nude, except for the hat. So David's weapon of choice is a slingshot, because he was an ace with the slingshot and he'd been using it to protect his father's sheep. So he took his slingshot, he took some rocks in the slingshot, and he killed the giant Goliath. This scene, when Donatello chooses to illustrate the story, is after that whole narration occurred. And he killed Goliath, and then he chopped off his head with this sword, and here's the head on the ground. So the drama's behind us. David has been successful, and he's just kind of resting. It's like all the adrenaline that has been in his body has flowed out, and he's at ease here, standing contrapposto with his beautiful hat. So that's kind of interesting. I love this detail over here. I think he looks incredibly beautiful. So it's pretty well known that Donatello was homosexual. So we see some homoeroticism in this. Just a very beautiful young boy there. So Donatello did other work. So he was called to Padua and created an equestrian statue of Erasmo de Narni. It was nicknamed Gattamelata. It was the first life-size bronze equestrian statue since antiquity. So I showed you this one in ancient Rome, Marcus Aurelius. And this is Donatello's. You can see how very, very similar they are. I don't think this is a particularly good sculpture. It's not very dynamic. It's not exciting. The horse, in fact, looks just very chunky, kind of like the horse of Marcus Aurelius. So Donatello did a lot of sculptures. But he also has a rival in Florence, and we've already seen him, Lorenzo Ghiberti. So after completing those doors for the Florence baptistry, he labored on a second set of bronze. Everybody loved the first set, and they said, "Can you do another set? We won't even have a contest. We'll just give you this commission." So he took this commission, and the format was different. These are all sort of squarish compositions. And so he did the second set of doors, and they were installed in 1452, and they're called the Gates of Paradise collectively, and are 10 in number. This is just one of them that you get to see here. It's called The Story of Jacob and Esau, another Old Testament story. And here, the only issue, we're looking at all the sculpture first, but all around Ghiberti in Florence, the painters are all dealing with linear perspective. So it's a very trendy technique at the moment. We haven't seen that yet. You're going to see it in a minute. And Ghiberti, he's a sculptor, but he wants to get in on this. So everybody's doing it. So he tries to do linear perspective here. And he creates this scene in this structure with these round Roman arches and converging diagonals. He also makes things that are the furthest away very low in relief. So they're barely rising up the further back it is, and smaller. So he's using a lot of depth cues here to try to create the illusion of greater depth in his relief sculpture. And the figures up front are really popped out. Something else you can't see too well there. And here's an analysis of the converging diagonals. Oh yeah, and he put them on a gridded floor. So all the lines on the gridded floor converge at this point, and this line should also, because that's one of the laws of perspective, is that there is a single vanishing point. And he kind of missed. That's okay, because, you know, when I showed you this one, you didn't detect the error, I'm sure. So vanishing point is under the loggia. And here's a picture. I've been close to copies. There are several casts that are out and about in the world, and I recently visited this copy, so I was able to put my phone really close and photograph these figures. So when I say they're popping out really far, you can see how high their relief is. So that's very cool. And here I am standing next to it, the copy, so you can see the scale of it. Each panel is not too big, maybe about a yard high. And this is the baptistry again, and these are the doors, the gates of paradise, the latest set that he made. They're still there, but they're probably not the originals. They're probably a copy that have replaced them, because things don't survive well out in the weather. So this is the end of part 3, which was your first peek at what's going on in Italy. And I say, I've given you a hint. You're going to see linear perspective in painting. So stay tuned for part 4. That will be the last section.